Hey guys, it's Kingdom Orange 2 here, and welcome back to my channel. I'm re-uploading this video because I wanted to give you guys way more Cinderellas to compare with one another. Now, similar to my newer videos, I will first start out by recapping the fairy tale, comparing the various versions to it, and then ending the video with my rankings. Also, like always, if there's any Cinderellas you feel that I have missed, feel free to comment them down below. So now, before the clock strikes midnight, let's get right into it. The Fairy Tale. The 1697 Fairy Tale by Charles Perrault opens with a wealthy widower who marries a vain and selfish woman that brings into their family her two daughters. The widower has his own daughter, who's beautiful and selfless, and her stepmother is so jealous of her that she forces his daughter to perform the household chores from morning to nighttime. After the chores were done for the day, she would often fall asleep by the fire, causing her to wake up covered in ashes, which led to her stepsisters mockingly giving the widower's daughter the nickname Cinderella. One day, the prince invites everyone in his kingdom to a royal ball. As the stepsisters begin to plan their wardrobes, they taunt Cinderella, telling her that maids aren't invited to the party. Eventually, the two stepsisters and stepmother depart for the ball, while Cinderella is left at home to cry in despair. Her fairy godmother then magically appears and transforms Cinderella's dress into a ball gown, as well as turning a pumpkin into a carriage and the animals around the house into horses and footmen. Before she departs, the fairy godmother warns Cinderella that she must return home before midnight, as the spells will become broken by then. Cinderella arrives at the ball where everyone is enchanted by her beauty. She dances with the prince and, just like her fairy godmother warned, remembers to leave the ball before the clock strikes midnight. The next evening, another ball is held. Yes, in this story there's two balls, and Cinderella once again dances with the prince. But this time, she becomes so infatuated with him that she loses track of the clock and leaves only at the final stroke of midnight. As she runs away, Cinderella loses one of her glass slippers on the steps of the palace stairs. The prince is unable to catch up with her, but pockets her slipper, vowing to find and marry the girl to whom it belongs to. The prince's herald tries the slipper on all the women in the kingdom, and when he finally arrives at Cinderella's house, he places the slipper on Cinderella's foot, which ends up fitting perfectly. Cinderella's stepsisters beg for forgiveness, and Cinderella agrees, marrying her two stepsisters off to wealthy noblemen of the court. Cinderella and her prince are then married, and everyone lives happily ever after. Now, before we move on, I am aware that the brothers Grimm published their version of Cinderella in 1812. However, the reason why I decided to recap only the Perrault version was because most of the entries on this list are based on that version of the fairy tale. There are a few entries in this video that are solely based on the brothers Grimm, so when I get to them, I will compare them to their version of the fairy tale. Bevanfield Films. Bevanfield Films is a British mockbuster animation studio that in 1991 made their own full-length Cinderella movie. Now, straight off the bat, this is probably the worst Cinderella adaptation on this list, because not only was it really boring, but it was way too long. Regardless though, one thing I found interesting about this adaptation is that it's the only entry on this list where one of the stepsisters is named Charlotte, which is actually one of the names given to the stepsisters in Perrault's version of the fairy tale. Now, I could be totally wrong about this, but I'm like 60% sure that's the truth. Britannica's Tales Around the World. In this direct-to-VHS series, the fairy tale of Cinderella is chosen to represent the country of France. Now, there's nothing remarkably different about their version of Cinderella, but one thing I did find a bit odd was that in this animation style, Cinderella almost looks like a child. So it was a bit uncomfortable watching scenes in which she was falling in love with the prince. And while I don't believe this was purposefully done by the animators, what makes this even more bizarre is the fact that Cinderella's voice actress kind of sounds really young as well. I don't know, do they want me to open an investigation for a child marriage? Charming. So in this movie, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, and Cinderella first appear at the cake shop, requesting the baker make a cake for their upcoming wedding. When the baker asks them what's so special about this man, the girls burst into song about how great he is and how he's each one of their trophy boys. Later though, when the girls return to the bakery, they find out that they're all engaged to the exact same guy, and the prince is forced to go to a place called Fire Mountain to choose one of the princesses to propose to. However, once Prince Charming gets there, he decides to not propose to any of them and instead gets married to this girl named Leonore. Cinderella Monogatari. Cinderella Monogatari was a Japanese anime series produced by Tatsunoko Production in 1996. Now, because this is a 26 episode TV series and not a movie, there is a whole lot more detail added into this fairy tale. For example, in this show, one of the plots follows a duke named Zarel, who attempts to gain control over the kingdom by trying to marry his daughter Isabel to the prince. The prince and Cinderella also meet way before the ball in this series, when the prince comes into town disguised as this page. Now personally, while I did really like a lot of the plot changes and additions to the show, part of me struggled to watch it, especially because there's so much time in this series dedicated to Cinderella being mistreated by her stepfamily. I wouldn't even describe myself as a sensitive person, and I was uncomfortable seeing it play out. Cinderella, Once Upon a Time in the West. The 2012 movie takes the fairy tale of Cinderella and places it within the Old Wild West. In this version of the story, Cinderella is a deer who lives in a western town called Felicity City, which was named after her pug stepmother. One day, a dog prince from Europe arrives in town and Felicity throws a party at the saloon, hoping that the prince will marry one of her daughters. Unfortunately though, on the night of the ball, the prince's mother, the Turkey Queen, is kidnapped by a pair of guerrilla bandits, and Cinderella and the prince set off to find and rescue her. Now, while I appreciated this very unique approach to the story, like how instead of Cinderella missing a glass slipper, she loses a tooth, I personally find Wild West movies to be very boring. Also, I really want to know what exactly the animators were smoking in the studio, because some of the character designs in this movie are so uncanny, they make me feel extremely uncomfortable. Disney. In 1950, the Walt Disney Animation Studios released the most iconic version of this fairy tale with Disney's Cinderella. Now, I would argue that Disney's version of Cinderella is probably the closest the company has ever stayed to its source material, as there aren't many differences between the original fairy tale and the movie. Another thing is that, of course, since this is a Disney movie, other companies will often copy design elements from this film, such as the style and color of Cinderella's hair and dress, or even the green and pink color schemes of Anastasia and Drizella. Ever After High. While Cinderella doesn't appear in the Ever After High franchise, her role is played by her daughter, Ashlyn Ella. Initially, Ashlyn started out as a royal, wanting to follow in her mother's footsteps and become the next Cinderella. However, Ashlyn is torn because she's in love with Hunter Huntsman, who isn't the prince she's destined to be with, and decides to join the rebel cause. Now, being related to Cinderella, Ashlyn is fond of nature and animals, and also indulges into her obsession with shoes by working at the town's local shoe store, the Glass Slipper. Fairytale High. In the one episode of this franchise, Cinderella is first seen running to class, losing one of her shoes on the floor. Because of her tardiness and Snow White's and Sleeping Beauty's behavior, they are all given detention by the Wicked Witch of the West. However, they use the time to rehearse for the school's talent show. Fairytale Police Department. In the Cinderella episode of Fairytale Police Department, Cinderella is mysteriously kidnapped after leaving the ball. After questioning many suspects, two mice tell Johnny and Christine that they saw Cinderella being kidnapped by her wicked stepmother. The detectives take the stepmother down to the police station, where she admits to the crime, but refuses to tell them where she hid Cinderella, as the wicked stepmother knows that the king will force the prince to marry one of her daughters by the end of the day. Fortunately though, Christine is able to figure out that Cinderella has been hidden away in the rainy forest, and she and Johnny rescue her from being trapped inside of a cave. They take Cinderella to the castle, where they are able to interrupt the prince and stepsister's wedding just in time, as the episode ends with Cinderella being the perfect fit for the glass slipper, and the fairy tale being once again back on the right track. Festival of Family Classics. Festival of Family Classics was an animated anthology series that first premiered in 1972. In their version of Cinderella, after her stepfamily leaves for the ball, Cinderella wishes on a star that turns into her fairy godmother, who tells Cinderella that she actually knew her father and promised him that she would grant any of her wishes. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that many of these Cinderella movies that are based on Perrault's version of the fairy tale will oftentimes take elements that are only found in the Brother Grimm story. For example, in this episode, Cinderella is assisted by two doves that retrieve her other glass slipper and bring it to the prince. Now, technically, this doesn't even happen in the Brothers Grimm fairy tale. However, the two doves are details that were ripped straight from that version of the story. Funky Fables. So Funky Fables was a segment that aired on the Japanese show Heinkiki Ponkiki. These segments usually take a more comical approach to the story. Like, for example, in this episode, Cinderella's father dies after his stepdaughters end up spending too much money on his credit card. Also in this episode, Cinderella's mother disappears early on to pursue her dreams in wrestling, even though I wasn't quite sure if this was supposed to be a joke or that actually happened. Furthermore, this segment does contain some details from Disney's movie, like here Cinderella has a pet cat that strongly resembles Lucifer. However, in this version of the story, he pities Cinderella and calls a truce with the mice, saying that he will now only pretend to chase them around the house. Golden Films. In 1990, Golden Films released a 30-minute movie centered around Cinderella. Now, after watching all of the entries on this list, I believe that this film is probably the most most accurate to the Charles Perrault fairy tale, with the screenwriters deciding to include both balls in their story. However, just like any other animated piece of media, this film is not without its changes. Here the fairy godmother reveals that she placed daydreams of Cinderella and the prince inside of Cinderella's head to inspire her to not give up hope on her life. Also, another change I really liked about this movie was that the ball was a masquerade party, so it made it more believable as to why Cinderella's stepsisters were unable to recognize her. Grimm's fairy tale classics. So because this is specifically Grimm's fairy tale classics, this episode of Cinderella is based entirely on Aschenputtel by the brothers Grimm. However, the show still takes a very large amount of liberties with their storytelling. In this episode, the hazel tree where Cinderella goes and cries has no connection to her dying mother, but is actually a living and talking tree who gives her a dress for the ball, claiming that it was one of the many things that's blown onto its branches over the years. Honestly though, the fact that this tree is talking makes it even more traumatic when the stepmother has it chopped down later on in the story. Also, another thing I found interesting about this episode was that during the ball, Cinderella never makes a typical grand entrance, instead sharing a private dance with the prince in the garden. Happily Ever After, fairy tales for every child. In their version of Cinderella, the story setting is changed to take place in Latin America. Now this episode plays out almost exactly like the Perrault fairy tale, but makes changes that are more appropriate for its Latin American location. Like for example, instead of lizards being turned into footsmen, it's a pair of massive iguanas. Now one thing I found a bit strange about this episode was it seems to have the shortest duration of Cinderella attending the ball out of any entry on this list. I timed it and Cinderella literally arrives, dances, and leaves the ball within 1 minute. Honestly, it's such weird pacing, especially since this episode has a 27-minute runtime. Happily Never After. So Happily Never After is a movie that was released by Lionsgate in 2006. In this film, Fairytale Land is controlled by a wizard who watches over each story and makes sure that the scales of good and evil always remain balanced. However, one day, he decides to go on a vacation to Scotland and leaves the scale in charge of his assistants, Monk and Mambo. Unfortunately though, on the night of Prince Charming's ball, their shenanigans attract the attention of Cinderella's stepmother, who finds the wizard's lair and successfully steals the staff from his assistants. Frida unbalances the scales, causing Cinderella's story to be cut short, and with the wicked stepmother now in control, she assembles a group of villains to take over Fairytale Land and asks them to bring her Cinderella. At the same time, Cinderella runs away, hoping to find and reunite with the prince, who's on a quest to find the fair maiden he danced with at the ball. She ventures into the forest and eventually reunites with Rick, a servant of the prince, who is also friends with Cinderella and secretly has a crush on her. Together, they are able to evade most of the villains, but Frida eventually becomes frustrated and kidnaps Cinderella for herself. Monk, Mambo, and Rick then arrive at the castle to aid Cinderella in their fight with Frida. Frida manages to knock Rick out, but accidentally creates a portal opening with the staff. Cinderella and Frida then engage in a fight, and Cinderella is successfully able to punch Frida into the portal, banishing her from Fairytale Land forever. After Rick wakes up, the two of them confess their feelings to each other. The movie ends with Rick and Cinderella getting married, while Monk and Mambo agree to not tell the wizard the events that happened while he was gone. Jetlag Productions. In 1994, the world-renowned Jetlag Productions created their Oscar-winning full-length version of Cinderella. Now, despite this film being based on the Perrault version of the fairy tale, it takes some elements from the brothers Grimm. For example, in this movie, Cinderella's stepmother tells her she can only go to the ball if she separates the lentils from the fireplace before the coach arrives, which she does with the help of a flock of doves summoned by her fairy godmother. Speaking of her fairy godmother, the one in this movie has a very active role in the film, with she and Cinderella meeting early on and the fairy godmother using her magic not just to get Cinderella to the ball, but also to help her escape when her stepmother traps her in the attic. Little Princess School. Little Princess School was a Brazilian TV series created by Video Brinquedo. In this acid trip of a show, Cinderella, known as Cindy, attends Little Princess School along with various other Disney princess knockoffs. Each episode usually focuses on the girls getting themselves stuck in some sort of dumb situation, like how everyone stupidly decides to touch their finger on a spindle, causing Cindy to panic and look for help. Now, this series contains some of the worst animation I've ever seen, with the characters moving by bobbing their bodies up and down. Also, since the animators only gave them one facial expression, whenever the girls get mad or upset, they look like their faces have been injected with too much Botox. Once Upon a Zombie. In the 3 episodes that aired of this web series, Cinderella is first seen alongside Snow White and Sleeping Beauty getting ready for the Wonderland Ball over Skype. While trying on a pair of glass slippers, her shoe breaks and Cinderella is transformed into a zombie. The princesses discuss the strange phenomenon and, hoping to seek answers as to why this happened, head for the ball anyways. When Cinderella arrives, she meets and dances with the prince, but unfortunately after the dance, he too is transformed into a zombie, and that's where the web series ends. Regal Academy. While Cinderella does make an appearance in the series, her role is played by her granddaughter, Rose Cinderella, who's the protagonist of the show. Regal Academy begins with Rose one day finding a key from a mouse at a shoe store. Rose follows him and ends up falling into Regal Academy, a school for the families of famous fairy tale characters. There she learns that she is the granddaughter of the one and only Cinderella, and that her grandmother is a headmistress of this school. Now, most of the show follows Rose Cinderella working with her teammates, getting into trouble, and practicing their magic. Also, since Rose is the granddaughter of the Cinderella, she has an unhealthy obsession with shoes. Revolting Rhymes. So in part 2 of the movie Revolting Rhymes, the fairy tale of Cinderella intertwines with Jack and the Beanstalk. In this movie, Jack and Cinderella are neighbors, and both of their storylines mostly play out separately and follow their typical plots. However, after Cinderella loses her slipper at the ball, her stepsister swaps it out with her own sandal, and when the prince has every maiden in the kingdom try on the shoe, she ends up obviously fitting it. The prince is so horrified with the idea of marrying her that he chops off the stepsister's head to get out of it. Cinderella is so disgusted with his actions that she confronts the prince about this, but in response, he tries to chop off her head as well. Fortunately for Cinderella though, she summons her fairy godmother, who turns the prince and his army into a pack of frogs. The fairy godmother then teleports Cinderella in front of Jack's jam shop, where Cinderella realizes that all along he was the perfect match for her, as the movie ends with the two of them living happily ever after together. Shrek. Cinderella actually first appears in Shrek, dancing along with Snow White and the Merry Men at Shrek's Swamp Wedding. However, Cinderella takes a more prominent and speaking role in Shrek the Third. In this film, she and the rest of the princesses are throwing Fiona a baby shower when Prince Charming and his minions stage a coup on Fiona's castle. The girls manage to escape but are led into a trap by Rapunzel and thrown into the dungeon. Luckily, the princesses get into motion and are later able to successfully free themselves using their wits. Now, one thing I found really interesting about Shrek's Cinderella is usually whenever a media franchise creates their version of the character, her personality quirk will be that she has an overbearing obsession with shoes. But the Cinderella in this movie is obsessed with keeping things clean, going as far as to scrub the floors of the prison the girls were locked away in. Simsala Grimm. Typical to every episode of Simsala Grimm, Doc Rock and Yo-Yo are here once again to assist the protagonists in their fairy tale story. This episode follows the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella much closer than Fairy Tale Classics does. However, since this is a kid's show, it does admit the more graphic details, like the stepsisters chopping off their feet to fit into the shoe. Just like in the original story, Cinderella goes to all 3 balls, but in this episode ends up not going inside of the 3rd ball, as her evil stepmother had everyone convinced Cinderella was a witch. Now, one thing I want to lastly point out is that in this series, Cinderella wears a glass slipper, but in the Brothers Grimm story, it's made out of gold, so I'm not really sure why they changed it to fit Perrault's version of the tale. The Triplets. In this episode of The Triplets, when the sisters are teleported into the story of Cinderella, they find her inside of a dirty kitchen wearing peasant clothes. They tell Cinderella that they are there to take her to the ball, but Cinderella reveals that the ball already happened, and that they are all currently inside of the castle. She explains to the triplets that the prince is broke because he invested all of his money in a company that sold air conditioners in the North Pole. Since the business obviously failed, the stepsisters lent the prince money, which means that they are now owners of the castle. However, when Nellie reads over the contract, she finds out that it mentions that if they are able to pay the stepsisters back by midnight, the deal is off, and the prince can keep the castle. With the help of the fairy godmother, the triplets throw a ball at the palace and are successfully able to raise enough money, therefore returning the castle to Cinderella and her prince. Video Brinquedo. So this actually is a second Video Brinquedo entry on this list, but in their 2005 movie about Rapunzel, Cinderella also appears as a best friend to the main character. In the film, Rapunzel and Cinderella are both stuck at the reformatory for rebellious characters, or a school for fairy tale individuals who are unhappy with the way their story is written. Cinderella attends the school because she refuses to be mistreated by her stepfamily, and believes she will meet a handsome prince all on her own. Eventually though, 2 princes stumble upon Rapunzel's tower, and a prince named Encantado introduces himself to Cinderella. At the end of the movie, Cinderella is finally physically able to spend time with her prince after the school is shut down for good. Alright, so last on this list is Wolves, Witches, and Giants. Similar to the Snow White special, this episode of Wolves, Witches, and Giants contains all 3 of the show's main stock characters. In this version of Cinderella, the witch marries Cinderella's father and transforms 2 spiders into her daughters. When her stepfamily eventually leaves for the prince's ball, Cinderella prays that a fairy godmother will come and help her, but the wolf appears instead. While the wolf agrees to try and help her, believing that her stepfamily are the 3 little pigs, Cinderella grows frustrated and throws the witch's wand into the sky. Fortunately though, the witch's wand transforms her dress into a ball gown, and she is now ready to set off. The episode then follows the usual format, with the giant appearing after the king orders everyone to try on Cinderella's shoe to see if it fits. Eventually, in the end though, the sisters are turned back into spiders, the witch is turned into a banjo, and Cinderella lives happily ever after with her prince, with her old home now turning into a castle. Alright, so now it's time for the rankings. Number 25 is Little Princess School. This is probably the only Cinderella on this list who I wouldn't feel bad if she was forced to live with her stepfamily for the rest of her life. Number 24 is Wolves, Witches, and Giants. I don't like how Cinderella's gown looks like a wedding dress. Also, the animation in this show is ugly, like always. Number 23 is Charming. I really hated Cinderella in this movie. I found her to be very obnoxious, and as much as I love Ashley Tisdale, I feel like her voice acting wasn't that great in this film. Which is a shame because her singing was really good. Number 22 is Revolting Rhymes. I don't appreciate her attitude, like how she yelled at the fairy godmother to give her a dress and slippers. Also, I wasn't too fond of her ending up with Jack because he looks like he's 12 and she looks like she's 16. Number 21 is Bevanfield Films. This Cinderella was so forgettable, I almost didn't place her in my ranking. Also, someone really needs to buy this poor girl a hairbrush. Number 20 is Fairytale Police Department. The way they animated this Cinderella's eyes make her always look like she's in a state of perpetual sadness. Number 19 is Golden Films. As much as I love the masquerade ball idea for this movie, her dress is absolutely hideous. Also, could the animators have chosen a hairstyle and hair color that weren't so awful looking? Number 18 is Jetlag Productions. This Cinderella was such a crybaby, but to be fair, if I was in her situation, I'd probably cry all the time too. Number 17 is Happily Ever After, Fairy Tales for Every Child. The dress that this Cinderella wore to the ball was probably the most boring outfit on this list. Honestly, it looks like something you could buy at Forever 21. Like, you really know it's bad when the ugly stepsisters looked better than Cinderella did. Number 16 is Simsala Grimm. I'm pretty indifferent towards most of the princesses on this show, but I really hate her hair color and think her blue ball gown looks like a tacky ripoff of Tiana's dress from Charlotte's Party. Number 15 is Fairytale High. I absolutely love the blue lipstick, but that's about it. Number 14 is Once Upon a Zombie. Her human design is gorgeous. Her zombie design, not so much. Number 13 is Grimm's Fairytale Classics. I typically love this 18th century style of dress, but for some strange reason, I don't like it for a Cinderella ball gown design. It's just way too formal for me. Also, Cinderella's friends in this fairy tale should be doves, and in this show, they made them pigeons, and I hate pigeons. Number 12 is Happily Never After. I love their version of Snow White, but their Cinderella, not so much. For me, the only crime she really commits is being boring. I don't really like her love interest, Rick, and think her ball gown was really tacky. However, I do love how at the end Cinderella becomes tough and stood up for herself against Frida. Number 11 is Funky Fables. Again, I'm not crazy about the chibi design the animators went for with their Cinderella, but I think her personality stands out from most of the Cinderellas on this list, and I do love that she has a great sense of humor. Number 10 is Festival of Family Classics. Is there anything remarkable about this Cinderella's personality? No. Did I enjoy her voice acting and her beautiful design? Yes. The glass slipper they gave her is hideous though. Number 9 is Video Brinquedo. The animation in this special was horrid and she is a total Disney knockoff. However, I did really like how she stood up for herself against being mistreated by her stepfamily and think she's a great friend to Rapunzel. These two though need to never, ever sing again. Number 8 is the Triplets. If the animation for this show was actually pretty, this Cinderella would have probably been ranked much higher. I absolutely love her personality and how confident she is, especially the part where she literally starts packing her bags because she's fed up with the prince. Honestly, I'm shocked that this Cinderella put up with her stepfamily for so long because she seems like a girl who would kick your butt with a broom. Number 7 is Regal Academy. I I feel badly not ranking Rose Cinderella higher because she is the main character of her show. However, at times she can be very irritating and annoying. I honestly wish that Rainbow would have toned her down just a tad. And there's also the fact that I think her design is for sure pretty, but a pink t-shirt with a shoe on it isn't super creative to me. Number 6 is Cinderella Monogatari. I'm a little torn with my placement of this Cinderella because on one hand, she is very well developed and a fun character with a kind and graceful personality and also plenty of beautiful designs to choose from. However, at the same time, anime characters just never really stuck out to me that much. I don't know if it's because I'm not really a huge fan of this genre unless it's Sailor Moon, or maybe I would feel different if I grew up with this show. I'm not sure. Somebody call a doctor because I might need my head checked. Number 5 is Ever After High. I admire that the animators at Mattel came up with not just a creative name for Cinderella, but also a unique character design. My problem is, though, I just really don't have any feelings towards Ashlyn. She's kinda just there. However, I ranked her much higher because she has way more character development than most Cinderellas on this list, but in all honesty, I wouldn't throw away my happily ever after for a high school boyfriend. Number 4 is Britannica's Tales Around the World. While the animation in this special isn't great, there is something really endearing and likable about this Cinderella. I just love how instead of being the typical quiet and shy Cinderella, she's loud and in your face. Also, the scene in which the Coach Pumpkin became her dress was pretty hilarious. However, I still don't condone her child marriage with the prince. Number 3 is Shrek. I know that Cinderella doesn't play a major role in this movie, but I absolutely love her. I find her ignorance to be funny, and I like that she goes crazy about cleaning because I love to clean as well. I also know that her design isn't super unique, but her Shrek doll is absolutely stunning, and I will never forgive myself for paying $200 for this doll on eBay and then stupidly just giving her away. Number 2 is Cinderella Once Upon a Time in the West. Even though this movie felt a bit like a fever dream, I really like the Cinderella from this film. She's such a girl boss, but not in an annoying way, and I appreciate how witty and proactive she was. And while you'd think that being a deer would be a disadvantage on this list, I really enjoyed her ball gown design. Number 1 is Disney. If I'm being completely honest with all of you, I feel like this Cinderella wins because most of them on this list are pretty bad or boring. Now, regardless of that, I still really love Disney's ball gown design as well as her kind and tender personality, but I feel like Cinderella's personality doesn't really shine until we reach the sequel, Cinderella 3: A Twist in Time. I also can't take away the fact that she's almost a cultural staple, with her castle being the icon of Disney parks around the world. If you liked this video today and want to see more content in the future, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you guys so much for watching today, and I will see you soon. Bye!